Hello and welcome to Addicted to Lacrosse, Season 3, Episode 1. Today is January the 3rd, 2016. My name is Graham Perro. With me today is Melissa Daphne. Unfortunately, Tyler Fitch was not available again this week. He is hoping to be able to join us next week. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties. You think that we had never done a podcast before, but believe it or not, this is our third season. We're just, this is obviously the beginning of the season, so we're just trying to get things back into the swing of things of how we did all this last year. So hopefully it'll go a little smoother in the future. We have a pretty good show today, hopefully. A couple of games. Obviously, the season started on Friday, and so there was a game on Friday night, there was a game on Saturday night. Melissa was able to see one of them, and I was able to see the other, so we'll have a little bit to say on those. And then we also want to discuss IL Indoor's top 50 list, which is the top 50 players in the league right now, as well as the NLL list of top 30 players of all time, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the league this year. So we have a couple comments on that, and Tyler, being absent, was able to send in a couple of comments as well, so we'll be able to hear from him as well. So we'll start off the games on Friday and Saturday. And as we talked about last week, we still didn't know the broadcast situation for the league until I think it was Tuesday or maybe Monday last week, where they announced that some games in Canada would be on TSN. Many others, I'm not sure about all of them, would be on TSN Go, which is sort of the online version of TSN. And that was going to be a problem for me personally anyway, because the way the TSN Go app works is that you go to the TSN Go website or use the app, log in via your cable provider, and then you could see everything for free. But the problem is your cable provider has to actually support that service, and mine doesn't. So I was kind of out of luck last year with TSN Go. So I was not looking forward to it again this year. But Friday night's game was on TSN, on the TSN website, without having to log in anywhere. So I was able to watch. I only managed to watch a few minutes of it, but I was able to do it without logging in or without paying anything. It doesn't look like there are any subscription services this year. There's no NLL Live, which they had, was it last year or the year before? Last year, I guess it was, which was $30 or $40 or something for a bunch of the games in the season. So that's certainly a plus for Canadians. I don't know how the game was broadcast on Friday, but Melissa, you managed to see it. So what was the deal there?
It was interesting using the new Fox Sports app. It was nice because it was prominent on the page, and I used my computer because we have Chromecast, so I just sent it to the TV. But it also was very frustrating in a few spots because, one, it wouldn't pop up until exactly the time it said. So it was like 7:25, and I think the game started at 7:30. So you had to iron out any kinks within a few minutes, otherwise you're going to miss the start of the game. The other issue I had was when it actually did start going, I didn't even realize because they had the screen turned off, and so I wasn't seeing anything. We didn't even see, we could hear the anthem, but we couldn't see anything. So I was sitting here troubleshooting a computer that actually was working fine, which I found out when I sent it to the TV, but I had no idea because it was all things like that, and their commercial loop was really, really, really obnoxious. But the quality of the game was good. It was like I was watching Altitude, which was nice. The only other random thing was the app would just randomly pause itself. So I don't know if that's something that is built into the Fox website that says, hey, you've been watching something for such and such amount of time. We want to make sure you're actually there. And so it just pauses it. I don't know. But we missed some kind of key plays in the game because that's when it chose to pause. But compared to some of the streaming we have had in the past, it was overall, in general, good experience. I was a little bummed to find that because I couldn't find the other game, and then I found out this evening that it was on ESPN 3. So I didn't realize that they were using ESPN again. I wasn't finding it anywhere. So for anyone else, if you don't have TSN, that's where the other games are going to be. So the game itself was pretty exciting. It was kind of what you would expect for the home opener. Both teams definitely had a lot of mistakes, some really great plays, some kind of sloppy plays, stupid penalties. But in general, it was good opening. I'm worried, and the announcers even commented on it, that Colorado has had an issue coming out in the second half, and with the same intensity they go into halftime with, and they showed it yet again. So they really kind of opened the door for Minnesota. Minnesota definitely was clicking. It was commented on by one of the announcers that maybe the altitude was actually affecting the players a little bit more, but you would think that would be affecting both teams, since both teams pretty much had to fly into our Mile High City. But it was some really exciting plays. There was one goal, I can't even remember now who it was, that brought to mind Brian Langtree, so that was kind of awesome. Some of the rookies and new signings, they did really well. Thompson definitely on Georgia made an impact. Jeremy Noble really was doing well for the Mammoth, so it was a good opening showing. It was very back and forth, so Minnesota kept in it most of the game.
And of course, by Minnesota, you mean Georgia.
Yes, Georgia. It's going to take me probably all season to get that right.
And if we don't mess the Minnesota-Georgia one up, we're certainly going to mess up Edmonton-Saskatchewan. There was an Isle Indoor article this week that I helped to contribute to, which was our predictions for how the teams are going to do this year. And I made the brilliant statement that I don't see any reason why Edmonton won't be as successful this year as they were last year, other than the fact, of course, that they're not in Edmonton anymore. So Teddy Jenner pointed out that I owe everybody a beer for that. But I think if everybody pays everybody else a beer for every time we screw that up, it's going to be a lot of beer flying across the country. Like I said last week, we apologize in advance for all the times that we say Georgia or Minnesota instead of Georgia and Edmonton instead of Saskatchewan, because we know what's going to happen. Second game of the weekend was on TSN 3 in Canada, and that was awesome. Just the fact that it's in high def on TV and on TSN in front of a huge audience in Canada is certainly great. So I managed to watch the game on TSN 3. It was broadcast online in the States. My guess is through ESPN 3, because ESPN owns TSN, or most of it, I think. So it's likely they have their broadcast thing set up the same way, though I can't say that for sure. So I missed the first quarter of it, but it looked like the Rush kind of started off slow and then picked up the pace in the second half, and they did end up winning that game. It was interesting that last season they took 2 full games to kind of get things together and start looking like the team we saw last year and sort of expected to see. And this year, it only took 2 quarters, and then the third quarter they started to kind of really get it together and looked really good. The announcers did mention that Curtis Knight was looking a little rusty, not having played a game in over a year. But of course, when you've got Mark Matthews on your team, you're never really out of it. And he looked really solid. So good game, exciting game. Both the games were right down to the wire. Where did it go? John Grant scored with less than a minute left in Colorado to give that to seal that game for the Mammoth. The other game, I think the winning goal was scored with about 3 minutes left or something in the fourth quarter. So a couple of good games, good exciting games. Hopefully I did see some tweets from people saying, hey, I've never checked this NLL thing out, but the game's really exciting. So hopefully we'll see a lot of that this year. Okay, moving on. I guess before we talk about the lists, Melissa, you had something to say about the new face-off rule. What do you think?
I'm actually a little confused about it. I didn't know going into Friday's game that they'd actually changed this, but that explains a lot about why the Mammoth cut Bob Snyder, because that was definitely a big discussion point for a lot of us Mammoth fans. But the announcer said that they're not allowed to use the back of the stick anymore to cradle and stuff, but from what they were showing at the face-offs, it looked like they were still kind of doing it the old way. So I don't know if they've truly changed that, or if I just was not being a face-off person myself, if I actually was missing something. But they're saying, it should speed up the game. But honestly, I always like watching the face-off battles. When you have two guys going at it, it can be pretty intense. So
I think the change to the rule was you can use the back of your stick like they have in previous years, but once you win the face-off doing that, you can only take a step or two before you either pass it to somebody or flip the ball around to the front of the stick. Whereas before you could grab it with the back of the stick and then run around and make sure that there's nobody near you before you flip it over. So they're just saying you can only take a step or two when you're doing that before you have to either get rid of the ball or flip it over. And I did kind of notice that if somebody won the face-off doing that, the first thing they did was kind of pass it to somebody. I was just assuming that it's too dangerous to stand that close to the guy you just won the face-off from and flip it over, because then he has the opportunity to smack your stick or grab the ball out of the air or whatever. I can't say I noticed that it was speeding up the game, because the face-off itself, if the two players are down with the backs of their sticks, and we certainly saw it a number of times last year where they'd both just be pushing and pushing and pushing and just standing there for 10 or 15 seconds sometimes, and you can see every muscle in their body is at its maximum trying to get this ball. And I agree, that's really intense, and it's exciting to watch that, to see who's going to break first. And I think that will still remain as long as whoever wins it flips it over or gets rid of it quickly.
Yeah, it'll be interesting probably to see long term how this one affects the teams, because obviously with players like Jeff Snyder, who often do score off the face-off, it could definitely change the game for some teams. Whereas maybe for other teams, it's not going to make a difference.
And interesting side note to that is that Bob Snyder was signed by the Roughnecks to their practice squad on, I think it was on Friday, possibly Saturday. So he didn't play in the game on Saturday, so he's not on the active roster, but he is on the practice roster, so we might see Bob Snyder in a Roughnecks uniform this year. Okay, if we want to move on to let's go to the NLL top 30. And I've got the list right here. I'll post a link to the NLL page that has the whole list in the show notes. But just quickly, I'll run through the top 10, and then I've got a couple of comments on the list, and then I'll turn it over to you, Melissa. So the top 10, really not all that surprising. John Tavares, number 1, Gary Gait, number 2, John Grant Jr., number 3, Colin Doyle is number 4, Paul Gait is number 5, Jim Veltman, number 6, Dallas Elliott, number 7, Bob Watson, number 8, Sean Williams, number 9, and number 10 is Dan Dawson. I guess that kind of settles the Elliott versus Watson debate, which has been going on for years, which was the better goalie. Well, it settles it in the minds of the people who voted, and I can't even tell you who voted on this. I think it was the NLL press, but I don't know who all is involved in that. So I had a couple of comments, not so much about the top 10. I don't really have a problem with the top 10. The one thing, or a couple of the ones I had, were basically that some players who are really good now and deserve to be in the top 10 or maybe even top 5 of the league now are pretty high in this list, and I'm not sure they should be quite yet. The biggest one for me is Sean Evans, listed at number 12. Now, is he one of the best players in the league right now? Absolutely. I believe he's number 1 on the IL Indoor list, which we'll get to in a few minutes. And I have no problem with him being number 1 on that list. I have no problem with his 2 MVP awards, 2 in the past 3 years. He certainly deserved those. And top scorer or top 2 in the league each of the last 3 years. Certainly one of the best players in the league right now, no question. But he had 7 seasons before that. Never broke 80 points, only led his team in scoring once in that whole time. So, I mean, he's always been a good player. You could say a very good player, even before the 3 years of 100-plus points. But if you take away the last 3 years where his numbers were off the charts, his points per game over his career is a little over 4, which is on par with Logan Schuss and Jordan Hall for their careers. And these are certainly great players, but I don't think that puts him in the top 12 all time. If he pulls off another 5 years like last year or like the last couple of years, then does he deserve to be in that list? Probably, but not quite yet, in my opinion. Similarly, Cody Jamieson at number 18 all time. I'm not sure I'd put him up that high yet. He's certainly been not the captain, obviously, but the de facto leader of the Nighthawks for a couple of years. They've won 3 championships in that time. One of the best players in the league right now, for sure. Number 18 all time. I don't think he's been around long enough to warrant that. And similarly, Curtis Dixon is number 23 all time. I don't think I'd put him that high yet. Again, if he keeps going the way he's going, he'll get there. Should these guys be, well, I was going to say, should these guys be ahead of guys like Casey Powell, who I think was ranked 20th or somewhere in that area? Yeah, and I'd put Powell ahead of both of those guys, I think. One thing I was going to say, and originally was, guys like Dixon and Jamieson have only played 84, 83 games in the NLL, so they really haven't been around long enough to qualify for the list. But you need to be careful with that. Darius Kilgore was number 16 on the list, and he only played 76 games. Now, as I was talking to Melissa about before the show started, I never saw Darius Kilgore play. His last season was 2000. I only started watching the NLL in 2001, so I can't say whether or not he deserves to be on that list. I guess I'll have to trust the people who made the list, as I disagree with them. But he only played 76 games. So does he deserve to be on the list while a guy like Jamieson, who's played more, does not because he's not there yet? I don't know. So those are my thoughts. Melissa, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same issue you're having. When you look at some of these players, I mean, there's some top players on here. However, you really do have to wonder about bringing up Cody Jamieson again, being ranked above Mark Stainhouse. You know, players like that, or Lewis Radcliffe. I mean, these are guys who really made a mark, and they're being ranked below guys who are just starting to make their mark. You know, can Adam Jones and Cody Jamieson be the next Gary Gait and John Tavares? Yeah, quite possibly. But at the same time, they might not play another game after, this season. You never know. And so they're almost looking more at their future potential than they are at their current. So it does make you wonder how some of these players were ranked, because some of them really just don't make sense to me, especially when it's supposed to be kind of, it's the 30th anniversary, and so they wanted to do probably players from all years. But if you're saying this is the top 30 ever, and then it really it doesn't seem as subjective as maybe it should be. Players like Pat Coyle. Pat Coyle was a great player, but does he really deserve to be ranked at 13? Is he ranked at 13 because now he's head coach of the Mammoth, and so he's a little more high profile right now? I mean, this was a player who was voted and rejected for the Hall of Fame like 4 or 5 times at least. He just finally got in this year. So if this is a player that really needed to be this high on the list, then it should have been no question he was in the Hall of Fame. It's definitely very subjective, and there's a lot more behind why Pat Coyle may not have been voted into the Hall of Fame, which we really probably don't need to get into. But it's hard to look at this list and agree with most of their choices. With Watson and Elliott, those were both phenomenal goalies. I definitely don't disagree with them being in the top 10. But, there's going to be argument over who who should have been placed higher than the other, but they were both top goalies. They're what most goalies get compared to. So yeah, it makes sense. You know, the top 10 I think is pretty solid. It does, when you look at the lower list, it tends to fall apart a lot more. I think there's a less subjectivity in, I don't know. I just disagree.
All right, I do have a couple of comments from Tyler on this, and I'll read directly what he said, and then I've got a couple of comments to make on that. So here's what Tyler said. Jeff Snyder not on the NLL top 30 is a freaking mess. His words. Basically invalidates the entire process of picking players. Snyder's won one, maybe two, was he in Calgary in 09, NLL titles. The answer to that, by the way, is no, he hasn't won any. Defined what good face-offs were for about a decade. But Ryan Benesh in the number 230, Ryan Benesh in the number 30 player with no achievements aside from being drafted number 1 overall and then traded for Colin Doyle. So those were Tyler's comments. So just to address that, Snyder was not in Calgary in 09. He was in Philadelphia. And then once he was traded to Calgary, they haven't won a championship since. So Snyder has never won a championship. And so originally I was going to disagree with what Tyler said because, first of all, Snyder has never won a championship. And he said Benesh had no achievements other than being drafted number 1 overall and traded for Colin Doyle. But he was Rookie of the Year in 2007. And he's been, I did look over his numbers, and he's been in the top 12 of scoring, including number 1 once, every year since 2010. He was number 3 last year with 113 points. So having said that, is he top 30 all time? Well, similar to the Curtis Dixon and Cody Jamieson, I would say no. If he has another few years like the one he had last year, then he should be certainly considered, but not quite yet. And I do agree that Jeff Snyder probably should be on the list. From what I've seen, I did a posting on this a couple of years ago on my blog about face-off stats and do they actually help you win games. And I looked at the number of games that where some team won 70% or more of the face-offs, just really dominated the face-off circle. And was that likely to lead to a win or not? And it turns out it really wasn't. It just looked as if winning the face-off battle may help in things like overtime, or if you got a face-off with 30 seconds left in the fourth quarter and of a tied game, if you're really good at face-offs, that can certainly help you win. But overall, it doesn't really correlate much with wins. But that said, he did change the game in terms of face-offs. Number of championships for a player, I don't put a lot of stock in. If you look at somebody like Brody Merrill, one of the best players in the league, one of the best transition players in the league for the last 10 plus years, or 10 years anyway. I don't know how long he's been in the league, but he's certainly been one of the top players, never won a championship. And if you look at somebody like, I'm just grabbing a name here, Scott Self on the Nighthawks, good defender. I'd take him on my team in a second, no problem. Is he better than Brody Merrill because he's won 3 championships and Merrill has won 0? No. So I don't think the championships really tell you much of anything. So anyway, I guess I kind of do agree with Tyler that Snyder should probably be on the list, and I'd probably take Curtis Dixon or maybe even Ryan Benesh off the list to put Snyder on there. So that was what Tyler had to say. Melissa, any comments on that?
I definitely agree. I mean, Snyder has had a huge impact, and he's one of the few face-off players that actually can just run right down and score, which when you're in a 1-point game can make all the difference in the world, or in overtime. So yeah, it just kind of goes back to when you look at some of their stats and stuff, the support for their arguments just isn't there, in my opinion. I mean, yeah, some of these guys are great players, and hopefully we're going to see many more years from them. But yeah, their rankings just don't quite make sense when you look at some of the players that didn't make the list that maybe should have, or that maybe should have been ranked higher than them. So.
All right. Excuse me. All right, let's move on to the Isle Indoor top 50 list. And I'm just going to list the top 10 here. I know this, I'm not 100% sure. Let me just take a look at the article. I have to look and see exactly what the criteria were. Now, they don't say in the article exactly what the criteria were, but it's basically the top 50 players in the league right now. So number 1 is Sean Evans, no surprise. Number 2 is Kyle Rubish. 3 is Curtis Dixon. 4 is Mark Matthews. 5 is Ryan Benesh. 6 is Dane Smith. 7 is Cody Jamieson. 8 is Adam Jones. 9, Chris Corbeil. And 10 is Aaron Bold. And if you're interested, 11 is Matt Vince. Thus also solving the Bold versus Vince argument. So when I was looking over this, my first thought about the top 10, I don't really have a problem with the top 10, other than they're pretty much, well, other than Rubish, Corbeil, and Bold, they're all offensive players. There's nobody in here that's listed as a transition player. I guess Dane Smith kind of used to be, but he was certainly offense last year. 1 defender and 1 goalie. Seems clear that scoring is what they were after here. And as a stats guy, I guess I don't have a huge problem with that. But we all know there's more to lacrosse than just being a great goal scorer. The only thing that I might change in the top 10 other than that is I'm not sure I'd have Curtis Dixon at number 3. Top 10, sure. Top 5, maybe. I'd put Mark Matthews a little higher. He was 4. I'd probably put him at 3. Maybe even Benesh higher than Dixon, but I don't have a huge problem with that. The other thing that I noticed when I looked over the list was that Brandon Miller was listed as number 22. And the only goalies higher than Miller were Bold and Vince at number 10 and 11. And I originally thought, is Brandon Miller really the 3rd best goalie in the league? And when thinking about it, yeah, maybe he is. Obviously, Bold and Vince are basically 1 and 1A in some order. But there seems to be quite a drop from there. You look at the remaining goalies in the league other than those 2, and there isn't a clear, this is the best of the remaining goalies. You look at guys like Poulin and Cosmo, who are kind of the old guard. They're not what they used to be. Both still solid goaltenders, but not where they used to be. But at the same time, you get guys like Chiliano, and Zach Higgins, and Dylan Ward, and Evan Kirk. They're certainly have the potential to get there, but they're not there yet. So I guess looking over the remainder of the goalies in the list, maybe Brandon Miller is the 3rd best, or possibly Nick Rose. The fact that they're kind of a tandem goaltender unit in Toronto it makes that hard to look at, because it's hard to look at Brandon Miller's numbers compared to, say, Evan Kirk's numbers, because Kirk plays twice as often. So that's my thought on that. So maybe Miller is the 3rd best. The only other thing, and this was related to the criteria thing I mentioned before, Garrett Billings is not on the list at all, and neither is Colin Doyle. Now, Doyle played a single game last year, plus the playoffs, because of injury, and Billings only played half the season, and his half the season wasn't especially similar to your standard Garrett Billings season. So if you're looking at the players in the league, does anybody really think that Garrett Billings is not top 50 in the league because of his injury? I don't think anybody would believe that, unless you know more about his injury than I do, and I have no reason to believe that he's not back at 100%. Similarly, Colin Doyle, I mean, he's 37, I guess, now. So he's getting up there in age, and he's probably lost a step or 2. But is he not in the top 50? I don't think so. So depending on the criteria, they may have looked and said, you need to have X number of points in 2015 in order to even qualify. And if that's the case, then that totally makes sense. So anything on that, Melissa?
Yeah, I think this one is probably a little more stat-based than maybe the other list. I agree that I would definitely change up the line up a little bit. I would agree with Mark Matthews. I think he is probably a more consistent player. Curtis Dixon is really exciting, and he has a great tendency to pull out those goals when the Roughnecks really, really, really need them. So he is definitely very exciting, and maybe that's why he got ranked a little higher. It surprised me to see Adam Jones, who had like 93 points last year and has been a very consistent player, to see him at number 8. I don't know that I would agree with that. But in general, I would say that this is probably a more accurate list, just as very general. There's a few players that are still ranked kind of high that their last few seasons I don't think have been as good, and so maybe they're a little biased towards that because they had some really great seasons. But this one definitely is interesting. It's just like when we're making our picks, you're kind of looking at the fast, and there's always more to the stats than what it shows. So it's always going to have more room for discussion. This one I think is a more solid list, though. I do think this is more statistically based, and I like that. If you're curious, if you click on any of the players, it actually has a kind of a breakdown of why that player was picked and put where they were. So it does give a little more information on that. It's going to be interesting to see if they do this again next, because I think they do this every year, don't they?
I believe so, yeah.
To see how next year's is going to be different, and maybe even we'll have to pull up what last year's was and just see what some of the movement was. But this one definitely makes more sense to me. The NL one, it just kind of like Tyler said, it just kind of falls apart when you really start looking at more of the details on it. It just doesn't. You just can't quite. You take the legs out of it, basically. Whereas this one, it's like, yeah, I can argue whether Bold is better than Vince or vice versa, but there's no argument. Those are the two best goalies, so they should definitely be high on that list. And there could be an argument made that maybe they should actually even be higher, because if you don't have good goaltending, it doesn't matter how good your scorers are, and if you can't keep the goal out of your own net. So this one is definitely, I think, a more solid list, more accurate.
All right, and I guess one thing I should probably say, as many of our viewers probably know, I write for IL Indoor every Monday, the Moneyballers column that comes out, like I said, on Monday. But I was not involved in the production of this particular list for IL Indoor. So on to our game predictions. We made our predictions last week. Tyler and I went 1 for 1, getting the Saskatchewan game right and the Georgia game wrong. Melissa had a 2 in a week, so you start off perfect. Let's see how long you can stay up there. And since you were perfect so far, we'll let you start with the predictions for this week.
Yeah, we'll see how long I hold on to that. I seem to start strong and then not finish as well. First one, it was harder because part of me wants to go with Georgia because the Swarm already have a game underneath their belts and they played pretty well. So I definitely think they're going to give Toronto a run for their money this weekend. But I think overall Toronto is just a stronger team. And so unless they completely underestimate the Swarm and just go in there real cocky, I think even though this is going to be a close game, I think Toronto's going to pull it out with a win. Calgary and Buffalo, I think the fact that Calgary played this weekend is just going to help them because they've already started shaking off that off-season rust. And so Buffalo, I think, is just not going to quite have that yet. Give them a game or two. With Colorado and Rochester, it's funny. I'm actually going to go with the opposite. Colorado, yeah, they got off some of that rust, but I just don't think that they're playing up to their full potential, and I think Rochester's actually a stronger team. So even though they have that game, I think Rochester is just that much better of a team that they're going to hand Colorado a loss. New England and Vancouver, I'm going to go with Vancouver. New England started off really, really strong last season, and we all thought they were going to go do really well the rest of the season, and they fell off, and I don't know if they have overcome whatever got into their head last season. So I think with this being just the opening game, Vancouver might just be a little bit stronger. They're a little more gelled. What about you, Graham?
Most of mine are the same as yours, and the one that's different I wasn't 100% sure about anyway. Um, Toronto, Georgia, I'm going to go with the Rock as well. Though, like I said, I believe last week, I did see a Toronto, Georgia preseason game a couple of weeks ago at the track in Oakville, and Georgia won that one. And I had to say they looked pretty solid. Their offense looked really good with the new additions all looking like they were seasoned veterans. So I agree. I don't think this is going to be a runaway win for the Rock by any stretch, but I will go for Toronto. I guess it would be nice for the Georgia fans to see a win in their first game there. Calgary Buffalo, this one was tough. It's kind of like last year. I can't imagine Calgary starting off with 2 losses or 3 losses or 4 losses and then kept going up to 6. I don't really see Calgary starting off with 2 losses this year either, but at the same time, I think Buffalo's a pretty strong team. If Cosmo can hold it together, I think he's second or maybe third oldest player in the league now. That Tavares is retired. Now goalies tend to sort of survive a little longer, John Tavares notwithstanding. But he had a pretty decent season last year. If he can keep that up, then they'll be good in goal. Their offense looked pretty darn good last year, and they added Darryl Veltman. So I think Buffalo's offense could give Calgary's a run for their money. Colorado, Rochester, I'm with you. I think Colorado looked pretty good on Friday. Like I said, I only saw a few minutes of the game, but I'm sort of looking over the numbers. They look pretty solid, but I think Rochester's just a stronger team, so I'm going to go with the Nighthawks there. New England, Vancouver. Can you take a team that's kind of crappy, add the best player in the league, and turn them into a really good team? I'm not a basketball guy, but I'm pretty sure that happens in basketball, thanks to LeBron James. But I'm not sure that'll happen here. There was a lot of turnover in New England, which is kind of par for the course for the New England and Philadelphia franchise over the past 5 or 6 years. Adding Sean Evans, I think, will make them stronger for sure. How can it not? But Vancouver had a pretty good team last year. Added Garrett Billings. I could see him gelling with the other guys because he's not. I don't know. I see sort of Billings and Dutch and Corey Small and that whole gang sort of gelling together better than Sean Evans and the rest of the New England offense. And Vancouver made a whole lot of changes to their defense, getting really stronger. There. The goaltending is the question for Vancouver, and I guess I went over this before. The fact that Tyler Richards is retired may or may not be good for Vancouver. So we'll see how that goes. But I went with Vancouver on that game anyway. We don't have picks for Tyler, so we'll try to get those as soon as we can get them, and we'll tweet them out or add them to the blog or something like that, so that we can get his picks before the games actually start. And I guess that was all. I did want to say one thing about the podcast, and I said last week that we have a podcast URL, which I will post in the blog at addictedtolacrosse.com. It's not searchable yet, and that's only because I put one in last week and I made it searchable, and we applied for to be on the podcast list from Apple, and they said yes, and then I realized that I had the wrong URL in it. So now I have to cancel that one and create a new one, which I did earlier today. So hopefully in the next couple of days, you'll be able to go and search for addictedtolacrosse.com or search for Addicted to Lacrosse in the iTunes store and find it and subscribe to it that way. But right now, if you go to addictedtolacrosse.com and check out the blog entry there, it'll have the URL in it. And if you enter that URL into iTunes, you can subscribe to the show that way. Anyway, so that's about it for the podcast news. Yeah, that's about it. Melissa, anything else that you want to talk about?
So I think we're off to a good start to the season. The fact that we actually have 4 games next week instead of just the 2 this week is, I think, going to make a big difference. So lots more to talk about next week.
Absolutely. Hopefully Tyler will be able to join us as well, and we'll be back to the normal 3-person roundtable. AddictedToLacrosse.com, like I said, is where you want to go for all of our previous shows, as well as this one in a little while once it's finished. If you want to get a hold of us, Twitter is probably the easiest way, Lax Podcast on Twitter. You can also email us at feedback@addictedtolacrosse.com. And we're on Facebook as well, facebook.com/laxpodcast. That's about it. This has been another episode of Addicted to Lacrosse. For the absent Tyler and Melissa, I'm Graham. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next week.